Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the Dancing Toaster. This is Nelly, and this is the place where we wrestle with the intersection of faith and the unexplained. Today is going to be another weird day. We are going to be sharing with you, I say we, my patrons and I are going to be sharing with you the last episode of The Man-Eating Toaster. You're going to be hearing about a bizarre vampire cult. Trust me, it's not what it sounds like, but it is a darker episode with darker themes. I hope you enjoy it. I know enjoy is probably not a great word to use, but I hope the content is engaging to you and that you learn something, that you're challenged by it. It was very exciting to put together for my patrons, and I want to thank them for allowing me to share it with you. Just to be frank, I need more time to work on the project that I have going on right now. The next episode that I plan on releasing with the Dancing Toaster is a big case. It comes out of Canada. It's one of the biggest paranormal cases in Canadian history. I'm going to be going the next few weeks by releasing stories that come out of the countries where I have the most listeners, as a way of saying, hey, thank you for checking out the show and for sticking with me this long. So Canada's going to be the first one that's coming, but I need more time to work on it. Life is lifing pretty hard, but you don't need to hear me complaining. I just want to give you something. I don't like not giving you some content. So today you're going to get a Man-Eating Toaster episode. Next week there's another special treat because the guys over at Nevermore Hollows, Alan and Chris, they have allowed me to share with you the time that I spent with them. So next week, special episode, as it buys me time to work on this trip around the globe. But with the next few episodes, it's going to allow me to get ahead of some of that work. Many of you know that I am senior pastor of a church up here in Washington, and that always is gonna come first, unapologetically. That is my calling, but this also is a labor of love. I love my toasties. I love all my listeners out there. Thank you for taking the time to listen to this show. It means more than you know, and man, I don't want to get all choked up. This is just an intro, man, and it's an intro for a really dark episode. I want you to be entertained today, to be challenged, and I can't wait to share with you the things that are coming, and I'm really excited to have you here next week's special episode with Nevermore Hollows. Those guys are wonderful, and we had some great conversations about the weird, the wonderful, about being creatives, about being Christian creatives, and lots of great things in store. This is one of many. I love you. I'm out.
Flight crew, please prepare for takeoff. Activation code required. Scanning. Login authorized. Evacuation sequence activated. Accessing archives.
911, what is your emergency?
Self-destruction. I am able to comply.
Officers are on the scene. In pursuit of suspect, west on Hall Road.
Synchronizing. 80%.
Take cover!
Engage. Dust to dust.
The night was thick with the promise of blood, an ancient hunger that never slept. In the hushed corners of a Kentucky town, a boy named Rod Ferrell was waging war with his own humanity. They called him Rod, but in the fevered echoed chambers of his mind, he was Visago, an immortal prince of darkness condemned to wander eternity. The line between play and predator was thin as a razor's edge. It was in those liminal spaces, cemeteries shrouded in fog, candle-lit basements where the smell of blood mingled with incense, that he found his purpose. The children who followed him weren't just lost souls. They were wanderers on the outskirts of sanity, drawn in by his promise of endless night. They were disciples of the dark, baptized in blood and crowned in the secrecy of whispered rituals. They believed they were vampires, but the truth was something darker. Rod's kingdom was built on half-truths and shattered dreams. A friend's murmurs of cruelty behind locked doors. A mother's indifference that bled into rage. These were the stepping stones that led Rod to the abyss. And in the hollow echo of his twisted kingdom, he began to believe his own lies. November 25th, 1996. The night the game turned into a horror show. A crowbar swung like a death knell in the darkness, and the air smelled of copper and finality. The living room was a shrine to oblivion, flickering blue light from a forgotten television set illuminating a father's broken skull, a mother's final scream swallowed by shadows. Blood was the covenant that night, blood that painted the walls, blood that baptized Rod's unholy quest. They weren't just playing at darkness anymore. They had become the darkness. Heather's tears would come later, but in that moment, the only sound was the crunch of bone under steel. Rod Ferrell had crossed a line no child should ever see, let alone draw in blood. They fled into the night, a caravan of the damned on a twisted pilgrimage to New Orleans, chasing a promise of salvation that they would never find. Their laughter was hollow, their dreams haunted by the ghosts of the dead. Rod was their shepherd, his voice a siren song pulling them deeper into the darkness. In the end, the vampire clan was nothing but a requiem for innocence, a cautionary tale scribbled in blood and madness, echoing in the spaces where the human heart meets the howling void. This is the story of Rod Ferrell and the Kentucky Vampire Clan. The night the children of the Dam tasted real blood and found nothing but the echo of their own broken souls. Welcome to the darkness. Welcome to the man-eating toaster.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the Man-Eating Toaster, the show that's all about cults and bizarre true crime. My name is Nelly. The show is brought to you by the Dancing Toaster podcast and the amazing people that support it. As you no doubt heard from the intro, today's case is lots of both. It was a strange cult of disturbed young people that turned into one of the worst crimes in Florida history. Before we cover it, I must warn you that this is not like the Dancing Toaster. There, I attempt to be as family-friendly as possible. The events and themes covered here are much darker, and that is not a possibility. In order to do the cases justice, I do not withhold very much. On the Dancing Toaster, we discuss dark realities that bleed over from the other side, but on the Man-Eating Toaster, the blood is very real, and the culprits don't look different than what we'd expect to see in the mirror. Today's case has a little bit of everything awful, harm to animals all the way up to multiple murders and everything in between. Don't say I didn't warn you. This show examines the worst that man has to offer, and in today's case we're going to start off by examining the sad, twisted mind at the center of it all. Roderick Justin Ferrell was born on March 28, 1980, in the small, sleepy town of Murray, Kentucky, a town that would one day shudder at the mention of his name. His entry into the world was the result of a teenage romance, one that flickered bright and burned out almost as quickly as it had begun. His parents, both still in high school, were children playing at being adults caught in the naive hopes of youth. They married in a haze of desperation, a last-ditch effort to paper over the scandal of a pregnancy that neither of them was prepared for. But the vows they took were as fragile as the dreams they once whispered to each other under the cover of night. And within months of Rod's birth, his father vanished, slipping away like a ghost that left no footprints. His mother, Sandra Gibson, was left to navigate the wreckage alone, a broken 16-year-old girl suddenly burdened with a baby in a mountain of survival. She worked tirelessly to keep the lights on and the cupboards stocked, even if it meant selling pieces of herself one night at a time. Under the harsh glow of neon signs and the heavy perfume of cheap whiskey, she took to exotic dancing, crafting illusions of desire for men who paid to believe them. But even that wasn't enough to keep the wolves at bay. She stepped further into the darkness, turning to prostitution when the tips from the stage couldn't stretch far enough. For those offended by that term, I refuse to candy coat or legitimize that life and call it quote-unquote sex work. That's a joke, and if that's what you're looking for, there are plenty of woke true crime channels that will lie to you and make you feel better about yourself and about the world. For her son Rod, childhood was a lesson in impermanence. The men who came and went from his mother's life, boyfriends, short-lived husbands, men who promised the world and vanished with the dawn, they were nothing more than shadows in his memory. They left behind only the echoes of arguments and the creak of doors slamming shut. Sandra's anger was a wildfire, quick to ignite and impossible to snuff out, her frustration often falling on Rod's small shoulders. Home was a word he barely understood, just another stop in an endless shuffle of apartments and houses, each one a temporary shelter, never a sanctuary. The darkness that clung to Rod's early years wasn't just the absence of stability. There were whispers, documented in official records of a deeper, more sinister shadow. Allegation of assault of a sexual nature at the hands of his maternal grandfather when Rod was but an infant. Wounds that would never be addressed, left to rot in the silence of family secrets. Those early scars sank deep, burrowing into his soul and planting seeds of darkness that would one day take root. In the midst of her own pain and confusion, Sandra found a curious form of escape. She spent her nights immersed in a tabletop role-playing game called Vampire: The Masquerade, a world where players became vampires, creatures of blood and eternal night. Maybe she saw it as a harmless distraction, a way to forget the hunger and the bills that never stopped coming. But when she shared it with Rod, it was like opening a door he had been waiting his whole life to walk through. Perhaps it's worth pausing to consider how cultural mythologies, particularly the romanticized darkness of vampires, can act as a siren song for someone already lost in the fog of trauma. From the gothic gloom of Bram Stoker's Dracula to the decadent nihilism of Anne Rice's Interview with a Vampire, these stories have always carried a dual edge. They're seductive tales of immortality and power, but they're also meditations on loneliness, alienation, and the cost of giving in to the darkness. For most readers or viewers, the allure of these creatures is a safe thrill, an escape that vanishes when the lights come on. But for someone like Rod, who grew up feeling like a prisoner in his own life, haunted by abuse, neglect, and the gnawing emptiness of a broken home, these stories weren't just fiction. They were an invitation. In a world that stripped him of control and identity, the vampire mythos offered a different story, one where the powerless become predators, where the outcast becomes a king. It was a promise of belonging and mastery, of never again being prey to someone else's cruelty. The problem wasn't the books or the movies. Millions devour them and never step outside the bounds of normalcy. But when your life already feels like a gothic tragedy, the fantasy of becoming something more than human can be a dangerous refuge, an echo chamber that magnifies the darkness already within. This is the tightrope we walk in a culture that glorifies anti-heroes and monsters. For most, they're a harmless thrill. For others, they're a roadmap to ruin. For Rod, the masquerade was more than a game. Again, it was the invitation, a promise of power and immortality, of a life that was more than the scraps he had been handed. He slipped into the skin of Visago, an ancient vampire lord whose kingdom stretched beyond the grave. In that world, there was no hunger, no shame, no fear, only the cold certainty of eternity. In that world, he was never prey, only predator. While other kids were learning to ride bikes and memorize multiplication tables, Rod was teaching himself to drink from the well of darkness, crafting elaborate fantasies of bloodlines and moonlit empires. The line between the real and the imagined blurred in his mind until he was gone completely. Rod didn't just play at being Visago. He became him. The vampire lord was no longer a mask. He was a refuge from the chaos, a fortress of ancient power in a world that had always been too small for his pain. In those flickering candlelit nights with the dice clattering like bones and the scent of old books and incense in the air, Rod found something he had never had before: control. It was a fantasy that would one day spill out of the shadows of his imagination and into the real world, leaving a trail of blood and broken lives in its wake, a nightmare that would consume not just Rod Ferrell, but everyone who followed him into the dark. As the days blurred into nights, Rod's fascination with the world of vampires stopped being a game. It became an obsession that infected his every thought. In the shadowy corridors of his mind, again, Rod ceased to recognize himself as Roderick Ferrell, the aimless boy born to a mother who traded fragments of her soul for rent money and half-empty refrigerators. Instead, he was Visago, an ancient predator who had walked the earth for centuries, forever young, forever damned. The fantasy bled into every corner of his life. He devoured the lore of the undead with the same hunger he imagined they devoured blood. Books, movies, and whispered myths passed around like contraband. His room transformed into a cathedral of shadows. metal hooks hanging from the walls like relics of a forgotten faith, blades glinting in the half-light, the air heavy with the scent of stale incense in something far darker. Rod wasn't just pretending anymore. He was building an altar to the night, brick by brick. The distance between him and his mother, Sandra, grew into a chasm she couldn't bridge. She watched helplessly as the boy she rocked to sleep slipped away into the embrace of monsters he claimed were real. He no longer spoke of school or chores or the small-town dreams most kids nursed. He spoke of blood and eternity, of a kingdom that lived in the spaces between heartbeats. It was only a matter of time before his fantasies turned to something real. The neighborhood cats became his first victims, silent shadows he stalked in the night. He lured them in with a predator's patience and then snuffed them out with weapons he'd fashioned himself. The air crackling with the scent of blood and something worse. Triumph. One night, Sandra found him standing shirtless in front of the bathroom mirror, a razor blade gliding across the pale skin of his stomach, crimson rivulets tracing down like rivers of sin. When she demanded to know what on earth he was doing, Rod's eyes were vacant, his voice flat as a tombstone. I wanted to see what blood looked like on my skin. There was no fear in him, no shame, only the cold certainty of a boy who thought he was becoming something more than human. Sandra's dread grew deeper. His room turned into a crypt of unspoken horrors, gleaming steel hooks, blades forged in secrecy, and the bitter scent of chemicals wafting from shoeboxes and battered duffel bags that held his silent confessions. The darkness was no longer confined to the pages of a game. It was alive and feeding on whatever was left of the boy she'd brought into the world. Despite the darkness swirling around Rod's upbringing, there was no formal Child Protective Services investigation recorded during his early years. His mother's descent into prostitution and her erratic behavior, swirling rumors of abuse, nights spent with men who paid to forget their own lives, were all hidden behind thin apartment walls and closed doors. The neighbors gossiped in hushed tones, but no one called the authorities. The system didn't knock on Sandra's door, and the boy who would become Visago was left to grow up in the cracks of a world that didn't want to see. When Sandra was finally caught for sending explicit letters to a 14-year-old boy, she was charged with unlawful transaction with a minor, a small sliver of legal accountability that came far too late. By then, the damage had already well been done. Those letters were a window into the twisted household that had raised Rod, a place where boundaries were blurred and darkness wasn't just a fantasy, it was a family legacy. The law caught up to Sandra's actions, but it didn't undo the years of neglect and secrecy that had festered like an open wound in her son's mind. Around that time, Rod found a mirror of his own madness in a young man named Jaden Stephen Murphy. Jaden was another restless soul who believed in the pull of the night. He led a group of outcasts at their Kentucky high school, kids who wore all black like armor and lived for the poetry of the grave. Rod gravitated to Jaden like a goth moth to a dying flame, drawn by the promise of brotherhood in a world that had never offered him anything but indifference. Jaden welcomed Rod into the fold with a ritual as old as nightmares. In the dead of night, beneath the twisted branches of a cemetery, Rod crossed over. They called it the crossing, a communion of blood and broken promises. Razor blades bit into skin, and in the cold, sterile moonlight they drank each other's blood. The iron tang on his tongue, the hiss of the night wind, it was everything Rod had ever wanted. A moment that felt eternal. Jaden's clan moved like wraiths in a world that wasn't built for them. Their rules were written in the language of shadows, loyalty above all else, the clan before self, and the third rule was no killing. Jaden said blood was to be shared willingly, never stolen. They cut each other carefully, a sacrament of pain and belonging, but they drew the line at taking of life. The townspeople whispered about them, strange kids dressed in black, inverted crosses catching the light of street lamps like shattered halos. In a place where there was a church for every 300 souls, their defiance was a silent scream. But Rod was different. He didn't want to play at being vampire. He wanted to be one. Jaden's rules chafed at him like chains, and he was tired of being bound. For a while, he found a twisted solace in their rituals, a home for the broken pieces of his soul, but that solace curdled into resentment. Jaden's refusal to embrace real violence, to cross that final line, felt like a betrayal of everything Rod believed in. He didn't want to pretend anymore. He wanted the darkness to be real, no matter the cost. In a world full of so many empty promises and fractured realities, Rod found a thrill in the hunt that no game or story could ever match. One evening near a trailer park that smelled of rust and regret, he reached for a stray kitten. Small, fragile, a fleeting chance at softness in the dark. The creature's claws met his skin, a quick flicker of resistance. That was all it took. Rod's lips curled into something cold and feral. He slammed the kitten into the dirt, then savagely against a tree until its cries turned to silence. Jaden watched in mute horror, the air around them tasting like iron and something darker. Shockingly, Rod just laughed. A sound that was empty and endless. Days later, the town would wake up to an absolute nightmare. A local dog sanctuary had been broken into. A place meant for safety turned into a slaughterhouse. The creatures lay in ruin, their blood not just spilled but used like paint. Whoever did it wore the blood like a second skin, drenching themselves in the warm red proof of their cruelty. The whispers started before the blood was even dry. The vampire clan. Everyone thought it, everyone feared it. Jaden's stomach turned to acid. He knew Rod's hunger was no longer a game. Rod's life was a carnival of violence and decay. School couldn't hold him. He was expelled for truancy and chaos. His mother Sandra was done pretending. She filed a beyond parental control report, a desperate plea to the system. Take him away before he destroys everything. She called him abusive, a predator in his own home. She told them he was self-harming, carving his skin open like he was trying to let the darkness crawl out or in, who knows. She said he was wrapped in a satanic cult, a creature of the night she didn't recognize any longer. While Rod's mother tried to raise those alarm bells by filing the report, a desperate plea that her son was slipping through her fingers, the community's response was largely muted, even indifferent. Teachers at Rod's high school couldn't help but notice the signs, the ever-present black clothes that seemed more like a uniform than a fashion statement, the morbid poems he scribbled in the margins of his notebooks, and the endless talk of vampires that hovered in that uneasy space between an edgy teenage joke and something much darker. Classmates remembered Rod as both magnetic and menacing, someone who wore his alienation like armor, who spoke with an unsettling calm about blood and shadows. Yet in those crowded halls of a small-town school, it was easy for his darkness to blend in with the usual teenage angst. Goth culture was booming in the 90s. It was a convenient excuse, just a phase, some would whisper. He'll grow out of it, they said. But there were glimpses that should have been more than whispers. A teacher once wrote a note home after Rod turned in a story drenched in gore, a narrative so violent it made the teacher's hands tremble as they read it. Yet the note was just a piece of paper, a gesture lost in the shuffle of day-to-day life. Some classmates said Rod's eyes were too old for his teenage face, haunted, hungry, like he was always somewhere else in his head. A few girls who once considered him a moody crush quickly learned to keep their distance when he described rituals of blood and darkness with a seriousness that made their skin crawl. But for all the red flags, some small, some glaring, no one really intervened. The guidance counselor's office never called him in for more than a cursory chat. The local pastor never knocked on Sandra's door to ask about the rumors. The small-town police knew his name, but not his demons. Nobody pieced together the nightmare that was brewing in the silence of Rod's room. Maybe it was the fatigue of the 90s, tired teachers, overwhelmed parents, in a community more concerned with paying the bills than peering into the darkness behind a teenage boy's eyes. Maybe it was the residue of the satanic panic years, which had left everyone either too quick to cry wolf or too scared to see one at all. Whatever the reason, Rod's madness grew in the cracks of that indifference, unseen until it was too late. The system saw a troubled teen. No one saw the murderer he was becoming. This was the era of the previously mentioned satanic panic, when America was quick to see monsters in every basement band practice and teenage dalliance with darkness. Evangelical preachers thundered from pulpits about ritual sacrifices in suburbia, and the tabloid headlines screamed of devil-worshipping cults lurking in the shadows. Every kid who wore black or red Anne Rice was suspect. Ironically, that climate of fear didn't lead to real scrutiny of Rod Ferrell's growing obsession. The adults were busy chasing imagined demons, too distracted by the cultural hysteria to see the real one taking shape in their own backyard. They missed the signs. Rod's violent fantasies, his obsession with blood rituals, his talk of vampires as if they were gospel. Instead of real concern, they offered empty platitudes and half-hearted lectures about staying away from bad influences, as if that could drown out the siren song of darkness already echoing in Rod's mind. The tragic irony is that while the nation trembled at the thought of secret cults, they overlooked the lonely, angry kid whose fantasies were becoming a manifesto. They saw the symbols of darkness in pop culture, but ignored the soul who was devouring them whole. In the end, the true horror wasn't in the albums or the books, it was in a boy who believed the darkness could set him free. Jaden, once drawn to Rod, had heard and seen enough, not only after the incident with the cat, but with the animal shelter. He and his loyal few went to confront Rod at his home. The night was thick and heavy, the air itself holding its breath. Rod met him with that same dead stare, the one that said nothing mattered but the blood. Rage flared in Jaden. He pinned Rod against the side of the house, his hands a vice on Rod's throat. Rod's face turned the color of old bruises. Sandra watched, silent at first, then begging for her son's life with a voice that cracked like old paint. Jaden's hands trembled. He let Rod go, but forgiveness wasn't in the cards. Rod was cast out like a demon from the group that night, exiled from the only place that had ever felt like home. Jaden would pay the price, a 6-month sentence that did nothing to wash away the memory of Rod's creepy laughter. But Rod's spiral was only beginning. He fell into a chemical oblivion. LSD, PCP, heroin, the poisons that blurred the edges of the world until nothing felt real but the violence in his veins. The line between predator and prey vanished. But the rot didn't stop with Rod. Friends whispered that Sandra's hands were far from clean. She was quick with her fists and her tongue, lashing out at Rod as if he were a mirror of her own failures. Rod told anyone who would listen that his mother wanted to cross over, to taste the same darkness he claimed as his own. And the truth was worse than the rumors. Sandra was later charged after sending explicit letters to Jaden's 14-year-old brother, Jamie, letters dripping with twisted desire and a sick hunger to become part of Rod's blood-soaked world. Police discovered a twisted shrine in her home consisting of photos, candles, incense, an altar built to the fevered dream that had consumed her mind. It was a home that devoured its own, a place where shadows bred more shadows. Rod's world was no longer a game. It was a slow-motion descent into the abyss, a story written in blood, waiting for the final chapters to be carved in flesh. Trying to rebuild what he had lost, Rod reached out to Michael Schaefer, another soul caught in the gravity of the vampire mythos. Michael was someone Rod had helped cross over into Jaden's clan, a brotherhood bound by blood and secrets. With Jaden's trust broken forever, Rod spun a new tale, a fresh lineage, a new clan that would rise from the ashes of the old one that rejected him. Michael, drawn in by Rod's unwavering conviction, agreed. Together they began to forge a new circle in the shadows, a haven for those who felt like outcasts in the daylight. Despite the storm that seemed to rage inside of him, Rod could be surprisingly charming, his dark humor and intensity weaving a spell that drew others in. It was a charisma born of pain, of a boy who had learned to make monsters sound like poetry. One by one, other misfits found their way to him. Howard Scott Anderson, Dana Cooper, Rod's girlfriend, Charity Kesey, and finally, Heather Wendorf, the girl from out of town whose future was written in blood. For many of them, the clan offered more than escapism. It became a sanctuary, a refuge from lives that felt small and suffocating. Like Rod, most of them carried the scars of homes that never felt safe or families that never understood. In the flickering glow of candles and whispered rituals, they found something like family. This wasn't just Rod's madness. It was the madness of a group, the dark magic of belonging. Sociologists and psychologists have long noted how alienation can make a person ripe for manipulation, and the 90s, with its simmering undercurrent of goth subculture and disillusioned youth, offered fertile soil. These kids weren't just playing dress-up, they were searching for an identity that the wider world had denied them. Rod's crew were kids who already felt like outsiders, standing on the margins of their small towns and the narrow expectations of their families. In Rod, they didn't just find a leader. They found a reflection of their own pain and a promise of belonging. When he spoke of blood rituals and dark kingdoms, it wasn't the violence that hooked them. It was the idea that someone finally saw them, that their loneliness wasn't an accident but a sign they were meant for something more. He didn't just offer them a new mythology, he gave them a language for their own alienation, a script for their secret hearts. This is the dark power of group psychology. It can turn pain into purpose, even if that purpose is destructive. When you are young and lost and someone hands you a cause, it can feel like coming home, even if that cause is built on blood. And this one was. They performed bloodletting and reenacted scenes from the vampire legends they clung to, but most of them didn't take Rod's talk of immortality and ancient power seriously. Even as they played along, there were times they wondered if he really believed it himself. Heather was different, though. In the hushed dark of late-night phone calls, Heather confided her sense of alienation, the feeling that she was always an outsider in her own home. She spoke of parents who seemed to see only her sister Jennifer, the perfect golden child who could do no wrong. By contrast, Heather felt like a shadow in her family's perfect picture. Mischievous, rebellious, forever at odds with the roles they had written for her. Heather's voice filled the static, telling him how small and unwanted she felt in the perfect picture of her family. She said her parents only saw Jennifer, the golden child, while she was drifting in the shadows. Their conversations stretched into hours, amassing an $800 phone bill that told the story of a desperate bond. As she poured out her grievances, Rod began to convince himself that there was more to Heather's pain, more than she was admitting, more than the typical teenage angst. To the outside world, Rick and Ruth Windorf were the model of suburban devotion, warm, loving, the kind of family that went to church on Sundays and had a well-tended yard. But to Heather, the walls of that house felt more like a prison, she said. She found a kindred spirit in Rod, drawn to his belief that he was something other than human, a vampire who had slumbered for centuries, reborn in the shell of a teenage boy. Rod painted her a world of secrets and shadows, of eternal nights and endless power. He told her stories of a past life as a French aristocrat from the 1500s, weaving tales of opulent banquets, bathed in candlelight and whispered intrigues that stretched back centuries. To Heather, who felt so small and voiceless in the world she'd known, Rod's stories were intoxicating. When Rod and his mother eventually relocated to Eustis, Florida to start a new life, he found himself closer to Heather than ever. Proximity turning their long-distance whispers into a shared insanity. Heather played along with her parents, telling them she was staying late at school to watch her sister's cheerleading practice. But in truth, she was meeting Rod in the cemetery across from Eustis High, a place where the dead whispered to the living and the rules of this world didn't seem to matter. They would walk amongst the headstones, their voices hushed but fervent, talking about art, about life, about the darkness that seemed to call to them both. In those moments, Heather was no longer the overlooked daughter. She felt like something more, something eternal. But beneath those moonlit conversations and the stolen hours in the graveyard, something far more sinister was apparently growing. Rod's words weren't just stories. They were prophecies he was determined to make real. And Heather, lost in the poetry of his lies, was already being drawn into a nightmare she couldn't fully see. Heather's sister, Jennifer, had always known there was something unsettling about Heather's friend. One afternoon, she overheard Rod bragging about his arsenal of weapons, knives, blades, and homemade tools of violence, trophies of the darkness he carried inside. When she confronted him with wary curiosity, he looked at her with a cold, humorless grin and said, "You don't see many cats around here, do you?" The words slithered into her mind, a hint of violence behind the veil of teenage games. The connection of Rod and Heather had survived the distance, and now in the same state and same state of mind, it thrived in darkness that pulled them both under. In his mind, it twisted into something even darker, a belief that Heather's parents were tormentors, abusers, monsters in human skin. And in Rod's fractured worldview, there was only one way to set her free. He rallied his new clan who were still in Murray: Michael, Howard, Dana, and his girlfriend Charity. They set their sights on Eustis, Florida. They packed their lives into Howard's car and drove south, the road a black ribbon beneath their wheels. Michael didn't make the trip. He'd already been sent away for his own demons, but the rest of them were determined to see Rod's dark mission through. The journey was marked by bad omens. A flat tire on the highway forced them to rethink their plans. The group abandoned Howard's car in Hardin County, and they hitchhiked the rest of the way. Rod decided they would steal Heather's parents' car instead, to escape with her, an omen of the blood that would soon be spilled. When his band of misfits finally reached Florida, Rod wasted no time. He met Heather in secret, taking her to the cemetery where they whispered their darkest dreams among the silent headstones. What they spoke of remains a mystery to this day. Rod claimed it was a ritual of crossing over, binding Heather to his clan in blood and secrecy. Heather returned to the group with news that sealed the night's fate. Her parents' car keys were in their bedroom. Rod told her to leave the garage door open. It would be quick, he promised. A quiet theft. No one had to get hurt. He had told Howard to stand watch while he stepped inside like a phantom in the night. But Rod had already swallowed a tab of LSD, a key that unlocked the cage of a mind that had always leaned toward darkness. As the drug took hold, he moved like something possessed. At Heather's house, her father Rick was dozing in front of the television, the screen's blue glow flickering across his oblivious face. Rod and Howard slipped through the garage, their presence swallowed by the noise of the TV. Rod hefted a crowbar, feeling its weight like an extension of his will. He struck Rick from behind, the first blow silent but final. Blood splattered across the couch, but Rod didn't stop. He rained down blow after blow after blow. The crowbar singing its deadly song 22 times against bone and flesh. In a matter of moments, Rick Wendorf was gone, his lifeblood soaking the cushions where he had once found rest. Howard watched, paralyzed by a horror he hadn't imagined. He thought they were only going to steal a car, not snuff out a life. Rod looked back at him with empty eyes, as if possessed by a demon that had found a home in his skin. Then he moved on, slipping into the kitchen under the noise of the TV where Ruth Wendorf was making coffee. A ritual of warmth and normalcy that had no place in the nightmare unfolding around her. She flung the hot liquid in his face, her last act of defiance. She scratched at him, leaving marks he would wear like badges, but Rod was already lost in the bloodlust and LSD. 16 times he brought the crowbar down upon her, until the kitchen was painted red. The monster then snatched the car keys from her lifeless hands and took what else he could, valuables, small trophies for a night that would echo in the dark forever. Howard, still frozen in the aftermath, finally found his feet as Rod dragged him out of the house of horror. Charity, Dana, and Heather waited outside, their breath steaming in the cold night air. Rod emerged from the garage, his clothes soaked and dripping with blood, a vision of death incarnate. Their eyes met his, wide with terror, silent with questions. But Rod only smiled, a manic glint in his eyes, and then the laugh. The sound was hollow and mad, the laughter of a boy who thought he was no longer human. They sped off into the night, the stolen Ford Explorer carrying them away from the wreckage they had left behind.
Behind them, the quiet suburban home was no longer just a house. It was a tomb, a testament to the darkness that had once lived only in Rod's dreams, but had now spilled out into the world. Heather's sister Jennifer was sadly the first to see the remnants of the carnage unleashed. The phone in her trembling hands felt heavier than any weight she'd ever known. When the police finally arrived, the house was a mausoleum, a testament to violence that had come like a midnight storm. Officers moved through the rooms, their flashlights cutting through the dark like knives, but the glow couldn't push back the cold that hung to the walls. Jennifer's voice cracked as she told them what she knew. Her sister Heather was gone, vanished into the night with a pack of kids who once thought they drank eternity with every stolen drop of blood until their friend was covered in it. A pathetic vampire cult. It sounded like a bad horror flick, but the bloodstains on the carpet and the silence of the dead made it real enough. The suspicion fell like rain on Rod and his clan. It didn't take long for the police to find their first lead. The car abandoned in a backwater corner of Hardin County, Kentucky, the first breadcrumb trail in the darkness. The license plate was a bullseye pointing straight at the kids who once believed they were more than human. Rod, ever the preacher of darkness, told his followers that the only hope for salvation lay in the fabled streets of New Orleans. In the twisted fantasy of vampire mythos, the Crescent City was a promised land, a sanctuary where creatures of the night could shed their mortal skins and dance in the shadows forever. Heather was crying, her tears catching the moonlight like broken glass, but Howard wasn't buying it. He watched her carefully, suspecting that her grief was nothing but a well-rehearsed script, played out to keep the others from seeing the truth. He was sure of it. She and Rod had sealed the fate of her parents beneath the cold gaze of cemetery statues. While still in Florida, they stopped at a gas station. The bright fluorescence painting everything in a sickly glow. Rod shed his blood-soaked clothes like a snake shedding his skin, leaving behind the evidence of his nightmarish ritual. The clan loaded up on junk food and water. The explorer packed to bursting with everything they thought they needed to start anew in a city that didn't care who they were. Ironically, they encountered the police 5 times on that long black ribbon of highway. 5 times the blue and red lights painted the night. A scary picture of all the times that perhaps someone could have intervened prior to this moment. But Rod, with the psychotic calm of a man who believed he was invincible, charmed the police each and every time. His words were smooth, his eyes empty. He was a wolf in the skin of a boy, and the police didn't see the hunger behind the smile. But by the 5th stop, though, even Rod's iron calm was showing cracks. He was sweating through the mask he'd built around himself. Paranoia gripped him like a vice, and he changed their destination. They wouldn't head to New Orleans, not yet. Instead, they'd slip into Baton Rouge and attempt to wash the blood from their hands in the muddy waters of the Mississippi. The crowbar, the instrument of their unholy communion, was tossed into that river, swallowed up by currents older than memory. But the river couldn't wash away the price they'd pay. Their money was drying up as fast as their luck. It was then that Charity spoke up, her voice a trembling hope in the dark. She said she knew someone who could help them, a family member who wouldn't ask questions. Rod, desperate and out of moves, agreed. Charity made the call, her words sweet and pleading. Her family told them to meet at the Howard Johnson Motel, promising help in the form of cash and sanctuary. But as they approached the neon-lit motel, the promise of salvation turned to dust. Charity's family had been working with the police the whole time. The net was closing in, and the children of the night were about to learn that in the real world, there weren't vampires. They were just monsters in human skin, and the law couldn't wait to bring them down. It was November 28th, 1996. That caravan of the damned rolled into that Howard Johnson Motel like a funeral procession in reverse. The air was thick with cigarette smoke and sweat, and the battered Ford Explorer was a coffin on wheels. They didn't get far. The minute they pulled into the parking lot, the place lit up like a war zone, red and blue lights cutting through the night, sirens wailing like banshees. Rod didn't put up a fight. The darkness in his eyes flickered, and he knew the game was over. His little clan was surrounded and they surrendered without a whisper of resistance. In the cold, sterile glow of the interrogation room, Heather broke down. She told the cops she never wanted her parents dead, that she told Rod not to lay a finger on them. She swore it was just supposed to be about stealing the car keys. Her tears were a desperate plea either to the detectives in front of her or to the ghosts already haunting her conscience. Rod, meanwhile, sat there like a man in a trance, his voice low, almost amused, as though it was all a dream he could wake up from whenever he wanted. But there was no waking up from this nightmare. When the reality of those steel bars and bulletproof glass finally broke through, he cracked. He confessed to the entire slaughter. He claimed it was his hand alone that carried out the butchery, that the others knew nothing of the blood he planned to spill. He was only 16, Heather 15. The rest of the clan, lost children playing at being monsters, were barely older, 17 to 20 at the most. The autopsy reports read like a requiem of violence. The ambushed Rick Windorf had 22 savage wounds, skull fractures, brain lacerations, and a ghastly gash in his chest carved into a V for Visago, the name of Rod's undead alter ego. Ruth Windorf fought back in the kitchen. She left behind 16 defensive wounds, her last rebellion immortalized in the skin she clawed from Rod's body. A shoe print matching the boots Rod wore that night was found near Ruth's lifeless body. Blood and bone and a trail of ruin that all pointed to Rod Ferrell. The police initially suspected Heather might have been more than a damsel in distress. Dana and Charity said she was just another kid, drawn in by Rod's darkness and swept along by the lies he spun around them. But rumors had a way of crawling through the cracks. 2 other teenagers, desperate for their 15 minutes of fame, claimed Heather wanted her parents dead. One was a 15-year-old girl named Amber Blood, who dialed Crime Stoppers with lies in her throat and a glimmer of twisted excitement in her eyes. But the polygraph didn't buy her story, neither did the authorities. After failing the polygraph, she admitted she didn't even know Heather. Another girl, 14-year-old Brandy Goney, she told the cops Heather had confessed to her boyfriend about wanting to bring in out-of-state killers. But her boyfriend, Jeremy Huber, denied it all. Said the only thing he ever heard from Heather was fear. Fear about what Rod might do. Rod's own mother, Sandra, claimed she overheard Heather asking Rod to do it. But she too backtracked after failing a polygraph of her own, her words crumbling under the weight of her own demons and her own past. In the end, a grand jury saw no truth in the shadows that encircled Heather. She walked out of that courtroom without a charge to her name. Ultimately, the legal system decided not to charge Heather Windorf with her parents' murders. While she was undeniably swept up in Rod's dark world, prosecutors couldn't tie her to the violence in any concrete way. There was no direct evidence of planning or participation, no fingerprints on the crowbar, no text messages or letters outlining a plot. Heather's own polygraph tests were inconclusive but didn't confirm any involvement, while the claims from the other teenagers like Amber and Brandy cracked under scrutiny and outright polygraph failures. Some said she wanted her parents dead, others said she was just a scared girl along for a ride she couldn't control. Faced with this muddled testimony, the grand jury saw more than a would-be killer. They saw a child trapped in the gravity of Rod's fantasy, desperate to belong to something bigger than herself. She was a girl who said she felt invisible at home and had found in Rod a twisted sense of purpose and belonging. In the end, reasonable doubt, both legally and morally, kept Heather from being charged. Prosecutors recognized that while she may have opened the garage door, she hadn't opened the door to murder in her own heart. To them, Heather wasn't an accomplice. She was another lost kid caught in the undertow of Rod's madness. On February 12, 1998, Rod Ferrell entered a guilty plea to 2 counts of felony murder. But the state of Florida wanted more than an admission, it wanted blood. The jury heard every chilling detail. His lawyer tried to paint a picture of a boy unhinged, lost in a labyrinth of schizophrenia and Asperger's, but the jury didn't see a patient, they saw a predator. Rod was only 16 when he committed these murders, legally still a child, but capable of adult horrors. His case, like so many others involving teenage killers, forces us to wrestle with the hard questions of juvenile justice.
Should the age of a killer lessen the weight of the punishment? Does a young mind deserve a second chance? Or are some acts too heinous, too monstrous to forgive? The Supreme Court's decision to end the death penalty for minors reflects a belief that children's brains and their capacity for change are still in flux. There's science behind this. Studies show that teenage brains are wired for risk, for impulse, for blind devotion to a cause that might feel like salvation in a world of pain. But does that mean someone like Rod can ever be rehabilitated? Or are there some wounds too deep to heal, some acts that can never be washed clean? These aren't easy questions, but they're worth asking, because every time a child steps into the darkness, it's not just about that one life. It's about how we as a society respond to the cries for help we too often ignore. It's about whether we see monsters in the making or children lost in the dark, and whether we're willing to do the hard work of seeing the difference. They initially sentenced Rod Ferrell to death, making him one of the youngest condemned souls in American history. During the trial, Rod's defense team argued that he wasn't just a killer. He was a deeply disturbed teenager whose mind had been twisted by trauma and untreated mental illness. They said that Rod wasn't born a monster. He was a child who had been shaped by pain, by the cycles of abuse and neglect that had infected his childhood like a slow poison. Forensic psychologists testified that Rod showed signs of schizoaffective disorder, a condition that blends symptoms of schizophrenia, like hallucinations and delusions, with mood disorder features, such as depression or mania. He also demonstrated traits consistent with Asperger's syndrome: difficulty reading social cues, obsessive focus, and emotional isolation that made him retreat further into his fantasy. These experts painted a picture of a boy who had never felt safe in his own skin. His obsession with vampire mythology, they said, was more than just teenage rebellion or a morbid hobby. It was a coping mechanism, a way to build a fortress around the wounded parts of himself. In the twisted mythology of the vampire, Rod saw an answer to his deepest fears, a way to turn his own pain into power, power to never be prey again. The Visago persona wasn't just a game, it was a suit of armor against a world he felt was always out to consume him. But the prosecution pushed back hard. They argued that whatever was happening inside Rod's mind, it didn't change the reality of what he had done. His acts weren't the random outbursts of a deluded mind. They were cold, calculated, and relentless. They pointed to the way he planned the attack, how he used the car keys as a lure, how he told Howard to stand watch while he killed Heather's parents. These, they said, were the choices of a predator, not the fever dream of a lost child. In the end, the jury was left to wrestle with a bitter question. Was Rod Ferrell a child lost in madness, or a killer who used fantasy as an excuse for the darkness in his heart? A question I think we too must continue to wrestle with. Charity Kesey got 10.5 years. Dana Cooper was given 17.5. But for Howard Scott Anderson, the nightmare would never end for him. He got life. The aftermath was a bitter harvest of broken lives. Jennifer, the sister who stumbled into the nightmare in her living room, was taken in by her aunt and uncle, Billy and Gloria. Two kind souls who still believed that light could find a way to pierce through the darkness that had swallowed her life. But they saw Heather as a shadow that could never be cast out. They banned Jennifer from seeing her, as if shutting the door on her sister could somehow erase the horror she had witnessed. Heather ended up with her grandmother for a time, but even that home was a powder keg. After a violent fight, she was sent to a psychiatric hospital to scrub the blood from her mind. When she finally was released, she found a new life with a foster family. Years later, in a 2006 interview, Heather said she found a sliver of peace. She studied art, married a theater director, and moved to North Carolina. She said Rod was charming. He could tell a lie like it was the truth. About the cult, she said, it was just something to feel special, a secret in the dark. Jaden Murphy, the one who showed Rod the door into darkness, said he kept in touch with Rod until 2005, until Rod cut him off, claiming he had found religion in the cage of his cell. Because of his young age at the time of the murders, Rod's death sentence was commuted to life without parole in 2005. His last shot at freedom would be crushed in 2020. Howard managed to claw a piece of his life back, his life sentence cut to 40 years in 2018. making 2031 the year he might finally walk free again. Rod, though, has nowhere to go but the darkness of a cell. In prison, he's picked up a wastewater treatment license, says he's married and divorced behind bars, but nothing changes the blood on his hands. His mother Sandra drifted away into her own shadows, starting a jewelry business, then vanishing into a care home when dementia came calling. Charity and Dana eventually walked out of prison, Charity in 2006, Dana in 2011, but Rod again will never leave. He's still there in that concrete coffin. A boy who wanted to be a vampire and ended up a prisoner of his own nightmares. His story is a monument to what happens when the line between fantasy and reality shatters and the shadows take over. He's still there, the eternal predator in a cage of steel and memory, a cautionary tale that echoes like a crowbar in the night. As the dust settled and the blood dried, the darkness Rod Ferrell had clung to for years revealed itself for what it truly was, a mirror of his own fractured soul. This wasn't just a story about a teenage boy who believed he was a vampire. It was about how fantasy can mutate into violence when the mind that clings to it is already teetering on the brink. Rod's story is a cautionary tale about the ways that trauma shapes and warps us. From the violence and instability of his childhood to the whispers of family secrets that were never confronted, his early years were a crucible of chaos. Abuse and neglect don't always turn children into killers, but they can plant seeds of rage and self-destruction that bloom in terrifying ways if left unchecked. This case also shines a harsh light on how vulnerable minds can be pulled into dangerous narratives. Rod's obsession with vampire lore wasn't just an escape from his pain, it became the architecture of his identity. And once he saw himself as Visago, the Vampire King, he found a sense of power he'd never known as Rod Ferrell. That's why it's not enough to say this was about kids playing dress-up in graveyards. It was about a boy who built his entire self-worth around a myth, then forced everyone around him to play along. Insert trans insanity here. Heather's involvement is another chilling piece of the puzzle. It forces us to ask, how do we measure the agency of someone trapped in another's gravitational pull? She was a girl who said she felt invisible in her own home, drawn to someone who promised her the power to become something more. But in that promise, there was poison. Heather's tears in the aftermath, real or not, point to how easy it is for desperate hearts to mistake manipulation for love. The social aspect of this case can't be ignored either. Rod's group was a tangle of kids who felt alien in their small-town lives, outsiders looking for purpose in the shadows. They weren't just enthralled by Rod's charisma, they were starved for belonging. When he spoke of blood rituals and immortality, it wasn't the violence that seduced them. It was the idea that someone finally saw them, gave them a place to belong, a cause to fight for, even if that cause was madness. The Kentucky vampire murders also remind us how society often fails to see the warning signs until it's too late. Rod was a kid who had already shown the world who he was becoming. He tortured animals. In this, I see the early signs of a serial killer. I believe that if Rod had not been caught, he most certainly would have continued his rampage. His sick alters to violence in his bedroom were yet another early warning sign. But those cries for help or warnings of what he was becoming were ignored until it was too late. Had Sandra even been listened to when she said, "Hey, this kid is out of control, I need help"? What could have changed then? We'll never know. And finally, this story challenges the way we think about justice and redemption. Rod was just 16 when he committed the murders, a child by law, but a grown monster by action. The legal system did what it had to do. He was locked away for life, but the question of who is to blame lingers in the corners of this tragedy. Was he born a predator or made into one by a world that never gave him a chance to be anything else? These questions of accountability, of trauma's legacy, of fantasy's power are what elevate this case from a true crime footnote to a haunting echo of what can happen when broken hearts and dangerous myths collide. And in that echo, there's a lesson for all of us, that sometimes the real horror stories don't come from the pages of a book. They're written in the quiet pain of kids we never thought to save. The small town of Murray, Kentucky, where Rod had once been just another brooding teenager in a sea of faded denim jackets and football games, was left reeling in the wake of the murders. In the days after the killings, disbelief hung in the air like fog. Surely it couldn't happen here, the townsfolk said in grocery lines, in coffee shops, in hushed halls of Sunday services. But it had. Parents clung tighter to their children, suspicious of every dark hoodie and eyeliner smear. Some lashed out in anger, desperate to find anyone to blame for the horror that had crept under their noses. They blamed the music, the video games, the role-playing games, the vampire novels. Others blamed the kids themselves, whispering about bad seeds and dark influences, as if they could scrub the blood away with a convenient narrative. The schools, once content to see Rod's dark fascinations as harmless teen rebellion, were suddenly under scrutiny. Teachers who had waved off his violent stories now faced questions they didn't want to answer. Why hadn't anyone seen this coming? The administration scrambled to roll out counseling resources, held emergency meetings, and preached about vigilance. But the truth was simpler and more damning. Rod's danger had always been there, growing in plain sight, and no one had truly looked. The police, too, found themselves at the center of the storm. They'd seen Rod's name before, truancy reports, whispered rumors about animal killings, the faint scent of blood on the wind, but they never put the pieces together. They either couldn't or wouldn't. Now, in the aftermath of real blood and real horror, they were left with the shame of knowing they'd let the darkness grow until it was too late. In the end, the small town of Murray was forced to look in the mirror and see that sometimes the real monsters aren't lurking in books or music. They're the kids who pass in the hallway, the kids you choose not to see. And in that mirror, many saw a reflection they couldn't bear to face. Now, as a pastor, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention Rod's current proclamation and alleged state of mind. Rod Ferrell claimed to have found Christ while in prison. In interviews conducted in later years, particularly in a 2019 statement, he said he had turned to faith and had cut ties with his old vampire persona. According to some reports, he said he had found religion in the cage of his cell and no longer identified with the dark fantasies that had once driven him, even cutting off contact with fellow vampire cult member Jaden. Whether or not this conversion was genuine or more of a survival tactic for life in prison remains an open question, but the official line is that he now considers himself a Christian. We have no way to know for sure, but we're told in Scripture, "By their fruits you will know them." Cutting off Visago and Jaden are both very good signs. We also know that playing nice in prison won't change his fate. As mentioned before, Rod Ferrell was originally sentenced to death, making him one of the youngest people ever sent to death row in the United States. But in 2005, his death sentence was commuted to life without parole because of a Supreme Court ruling that juveniles cannot receive the death penalty. He has tried to challenge his new sentence, including appeals that cited changes in the law about sentencing juveniles to life without parole, but those challenges have been denied. In 2020, his last known attempt to have his life sentence reduced was rejected. As it stands, Rod Ferrell will spend the rest of his life in prison. There's no chance he will ever be released. His case is considered closed, with no legal avenues left for freedom. If his proclamation of faith has remained since then, as well as a changed life, then perhaps he did have a genuine conversion experience. But since we have no way to be with him there in the cell or in those halls, we don't know for sure, only God knows. Now, some may be wondering, can someone who committed such an atrocious crime receive forgiveness and eternal life? Yes. The answer is absolutely yes. That is how big the grace of God truly is. That is how worthy the life, death, and resurrection of Christ truly is. Now, I know this offends many. The atheist that was a nice man who paid his taxes and gave to charity will go to hell, but the double murderer who believed in Jesus gets a pass, they'll say. And to be a faithful messenger of the gospel, I must say yes, because God doesn't grade on a curve, you see. We are aware that Rod Ferrell firmly broke the sixth commandment, "Thou shalt not murder." But the false juxtaposition suggests the atheist has not transgressed God's law, and this is not true. 1. Have no other gods before me. The atheist has placed themselves in that spot. 2. You shall not make any idols. Again, their entire life is an altar to self and to humanity. 3. Do not take the name of the Lord in vain. Though the atheist has rejected the name of God, they still bear his image and have blasphemed him their entire lives. 4. Keep the Sabbath. Though there is much debate within Christendom around this command, we can know that the atheist has not set a single day aside to reflect on God's goodness. 5. Honor thy mother and father. Notice it doesn't say to honor them if they're honorable. Suffice it to say that we have all dishonored our parents with our constant disobedience of their commands to us. 6. Thou shalt not murder, where the self-righteousness of the atheist truly begins to shine. Jesus said in Matthew 5 that if you've hated someone in your heart, he likens this to murder. Anybody that's watched any amount of true crime knows that hatred is the earliest seed of murder. Some even listening right now, if you were being honest entirely, you may have committed such an act if you thought you could have gotten away with it. 7. Do not commit adultery. Again, a famous favorite stop for the self-righteous. But Jesus said in Matthew 5, if you've lusted in your heart for another, you've committed adultery. 8. Do not steal. All of us have taken something that didn't belong to us, even if something small. 9. Don't bear false witness. We have all lied and told lies about other people that have had negative ramifications. And 10. Do not covet. We have all allowed our hearts to fill with envy and desire towards another's possessions or lot in life. Heck, modern Western civilization is built upon these illicit desires. Now, why did I do that? Why did I force you to walk through all 10 commandments with me? Well, if I haven't lost you by now, well, it was to destroy that sense of self-righteousness that says Rod Ferrell deserves hell and I deserve heaven. And the truth of the matter is, when we look at the perfect law of God, Rod Ferrell and I both deserve hell. Perfection is the prerequisite for heaven. Rod doesn't have it, but neither did you. Neither do I. Then who gets in? Who then can be saved? If God hadn't done something about our situation, none of us would get in. None of us would be saved. But God, who is rich in mercy and love, wrapped himself in humanity, became one of us, lived and walked among us, lived the life we couldn't live, died the death we deserved to die, but then he rose from the dead to prove he was God, to prove he had the authority to grant us the forgiveness of our sins. All we have to do is repent and believe upon the Lord Jesus and his finished work on the cross. Regardless of how many laws you've broken or how badly you've broken them, Christ is the only hope for the atheist, for the murderer, for the liar, for the thief, for the prostitute, for the drug addict. Christ alone saves, and there isn't anyone he'll turn away if they come sincerely, contritely, and they repent of their sins and receive his grace. This is what some have called the scandal of grace. But it's only scandalous if you think you're better than others and that your sins are somehow less offensive than the sins of others. Rod Ferrell did heinous things. But what you don't know is what things you would have done if your father abandoned you, your mother was a prostitute, if she treated you like a tyrant, if your grandfather abused you sexually, and you had things going on in your head that no one took the time to try to understand. Let me be clear, I'm not trying to defend Rod Ferrell. He is right where he belongs given the severity of his actions. But the destination of his soul, if he has truly repented and given his life to Jesus, his atrocities were placed upon Christ along with everyone else's who comes to him by faith. I know, not your typical true crime episode. This is not the show to discuss if vampires are real or ever have been. I got another show just for that kind of stuff. We just know that Rod wasn't a vampire. He was a broken young man that gave in to the darkest of desires. Did he have external influences of a spiritual nature? Oh yes, I believe so. But that makes him no less accountable for the choices that he made. He isn't the first, he won't be the last. We can't change his fate or the fate of the Wendorfs, but we can check our own lives and our own hearts, and we can look around at those around us and see if we can prevent another Rod Ferrell by extending some love and kindness, by giving some time, or maybe even rescue a future Heather Wendorf before someone like Rod rots her brain with nonsense. In the end, Rod's blood-soaked fantasy died behind bars, but the echoes of that night in Florida still linger. In the silence of small towns, in the fragile minds of the young, in the places where myth and reality blur. We've walked the midnight roads with the vampire clan of Kentucky. We've seen how the line between game and nightmare can vanish in an instant, and maybe that's the real horror. That the darkness is never far away, it lives in the quiet hearts of those who feel unseen. I want to thank you for joining me on this dark ride. I hope you found something of value in it. I've done many other deep dives, and I have many more to come. Sadly, there is no end to the number of stories like this for us to examine. I have Dancing Toaster merch available at thedancingtoasterstore.printful.me. Soon I will have man-eating toaster merch in that same store. I thank you for the love and support. Please like, share, subscribe, follow, rate, review, do all the things wherever you consume the man-eating toaster. But don't eat toasters, and don't let any vampires eat you. I love you. I'm out.
Flight crew, please prepare for takeoff. Activation code required. Scanning. Login authorized. Evaluation sequence activated. Accessing archives.
911, what is your emergency?
Suspect is armed.
Self-destruction.